The knock came at 0347 hours. Sharp and deliberate, like military precision cutting through the pre-dawn silence. I knew that sound. Official. Unavoidable. Final. Through the peephole, two figures stood in the hallway shadows, their posture unmistakably authoritative, even in the dim emergency lighting. Military police. My heart didn't race anymore when unexpected visitors arrived at my door. 3 tours in Afghanistan had taught me that panic was a luxury I couldn't afford, but my hand still instinctively moved to the scar on my left shoulder, a nervous habit I'd developed since coming home. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I was Captain Sarah Martinez, formerly of the 82nd Airborne Division, currently of Apartment 4B in a rundown complex in Denver, Colorado. The kind of place where thin walls carried every argument, every late-night TV show, every nightmare that escaped through gritted teeth. I'd been living here for 8 months, ever since the VA housing assistance finally came through. It wasn't much, but it was mine. 4 walls, a roof, and blessed silence when the world cooperated. The silence hadn't been cooperating lately. 3 weeks ago, the complaints started. My neighbor in 4C, a man named Gerald Whitman, had taken it upon himself to document every disturbance from my unit. The building manager, Mrs. Chen, had knocked on my door with a clipboard and an apologetic expression. Noise complaints, she'd explained, shouting in the middle of the night. Furniture being moved at odd hours. Disruptive behavior that was disturbing other tenants. I'd tried to explain about the nightmares, about the way sleep came in fragments when it came at all, about how sometimes I woke up on the floor behind my couch because my subconscious still believed cover was survival. Mrs. Chen had nodded sympathetically, but the complaints kept coming. Gerald Whitman had apparently appointed himself the building's unofficial peace officer, and he was thorough in his documentation. The MP at my door was a woman, Sergeant First Class by her stripes, with the kind of steady gaze that had seen difficult situations before. Her partner stood slightly back, giving her room to take the lead. She held up her identification with practiced efficiency. Captain Martinez? I'm Sergeant Brooks. This is Corporal Williams. We need to speak with you about some allegations that have been made. I stepped back to let them in, my mind already calculating what this could mean. Military police didn't show up for apartment noise complaints. This was something bigger, something that had escalated beyond building management and moved into military jurisdiction. The implications made my stomach tighten. My apartment was sparse by design, a couch that doubled as a fortress when sleep brought unwanted visitors from Kandahar. A small dining table where I ate meals standing up because sitting with my back to the door felt like exposure. Blackout curtains that kept the world at a manageable distance. No photographs on the walls, no mementos from deployment. Those memories lived in my body now, in the way my shoulders tensed at unexpected sounds, in the way I automatically scanned exit routes wherever I went. Sergeant Brooks took in the space with professional neutrality. She'd probably seen apartments like this before, understood what sparse living arrangements meant for veterans trying to rebuild their civilian lives. Corporal Williams remained by the door, not blocking it but positioned where he could observe both me and the hallway. Captain, we've received some serious allegations from a civilian complainant. Brooks began, her voice carrying the weight of official business. Mr. Gerald Whitman has contacted military authorities claiming that you've been making threatening statements and engaging in behavior that he considers dangerous to building residents. The words hit me like incoming rounds. Threatening statements. Dangerous behavior. In Gerald Whitman's version of events, my struggles with PTSD had somehow transformed me into a threat to community safety. I could feel the familiar tightness in my chest, the way breathing became a conscious effort when stress triggered my body's alarm systems. Sergeant, I need you to understand something, I said, choosing my words with the precision that military communication had taught me. I have been dealing with some adjustment challenges since my return from deployment. I've been working with VA counselors and following all recommended treatment protocols. At no point have I made threats against any resident of this building. Brooks nodded, making notes in a small pad. Can you tell me about the nature of these adjustment challenges, Captain? The question required honesty that felt like exposure. Military culture had trained me to handle problems internally, to project strength, even when strength felt like a daily battle. Admitting to struggles felt like admitting to failure, even though my rational mind knew better. PTSD, Sergeant. Diagnosed 6 months ago, currently in treatment. It manifests primarily as sleep disturbances and hypervigilance. Sometimes I have nightmares that cause me to speak or move during sleep. I've been working on management strategies, but the process takes time. Have you had any direct confrontations with Mr. Whitman? I thought back to the handful of interactions I'd had with Gerald. A man in his 60s, retired from some office job, with the kind of rigid schedule that made him acutely aware of any deviation from building normalcy. He'd approached me twice in the hallway, both times with complaints about noise levels and what he termed disruptive patterns. 2 brief conversations in the building hallway. He expressed concerns about noise from my apartment during nighttime hours. I explained that I was working on the issue and apologized for any disturbance. At no point did I make threats or engage in aggressive behavior toward him. Brooks continued taking notes. Mr. Whitman claims that during your second conversation, you told him that he had no idea what real danger looked like, and that if he kept bothering you, he might find out. He interpreted this as a threat. The memory came back with sharp clarity. Gerald had cornered me near the mailboxes after a particularly difficult night. I'd been operating on 2 hours of sleep, still feeling the adrenaline residue from a nightmare that had left me pressed against my bedroom wall until sunrise. He'd launched into a lecture about consideration for neighbors and appropriate living standards, his voice carrying the assumption that my struggles were somehow a choice I was making. That conversation occurred after he told me that military personnel should learn to control themselves or find somewhere else to live, I explained. I responded that combat veterans deal with challenges that civilian populations don't always understand, and that I hoped he never had to experience the kind of dangers that create lasting trauma. It wasn't a threat, Sergeant. It was an attempt to provide context for his lack of empathy. But I could see how Gerald Whitman might have twisted those words, might have filtered them through his own fears and prejudices to create a narrative where I was the aggressor, rather than someone struggling to rebuild a peaceful life after war. Williams spoke up from his position by the door. Captain, are you currently receiving treatment through the VA system? Yes, Corporal. Weekly counseling sessions with Dr. Amanda Foster at the Denver VA Medical Center. I can provide contact information for verification. I'm also part of a veteran support group that meets twice weekly. The support group was something Dr. Foster had recommended, a circle of former military personnel dealing with similar transitions. 8 veterans from different branches and deployment experiences, gathering in the basement of a community center to share strategies for managing civilian life. The group had become an anchor, a place where hypervigilance was understood rather than pathologized, where nightmares were met with.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Knowing nods rather than fearful stares. Brooks looked up from her notes. We'll need to verify your treatment status and speak with your counselor about your current condition. This is standard procedure when allegations like this are made against active or recently separated military personnel. The weight of bureaucracy was settling around me like a familiar uniform. I understood the process, the need for official documentation and professional assessments. But understanding didn't make the situation less humiliating. 3 tours of duty, a Bronze Star with Valor device, commendations for leadership under fire, and now I was being investigated because a civilian neighbor couldn't tolerate the sound of someone fighting battles in their sleep. I need you both to understand something, I said, meeting Brooks' eyes directly. I chose this apartment specifically because it was affordable and allowed me to begin rebuilding my civilian life. I've been working every day to manage my condition and minimize impact on others. I've never been violent toward civilians, never made actual threats, never engaged in behavior that would genuinely endanger anyone in this building. We understand, Captain, Brooks replied. But we have to investigate all allegations thoroughly. Mr. Whitman has also claimed that you've been seen in the building's common areas at unusual hours, that you sometimes appear to be monitoring other residents' activities. This accusation cut deeper because it contained a grain of truth wrapped in misunderstanding. Yes, I sometimes walked the hallways at night when sleep proved impossible. Yes, I was aware of the building's rhythms, the sounds that belonged and the ones that didn't. Hypervigilance wasn't something I could switch off like a radio. It was a survival mechanism that had kept me alive in Kandahar and now made civilian life feel like a constant state of low-level alert. Hypervigilance is a common symptom of PTSD, Sergeant. It means being acutely aware of your environment and potential threats, even when those threats are unlikely. When I can't sleep, I sometimes walk to help manage anxiety. I'm not monitoring anyone. I'm trying to convince my nervous system that this building is safe. Williams made a note in his own pad. Have you considered that your behavior, even if well-intentioned, might be making other residents uncomfortable? The question stung because it highlighted the impossible balance veterans with PTSD had to navigate. If I isolated completely, I risked deepening depression and losing connection with civilian society. If I engaged normally, my symptoms might manifest in ways that civilian populations found disturbing or threatening. There was no perfect solution, no way to be both healing and invisible. I've been working with my counselor on finding that balance, Corporal. It's an ongoing process. But I want to be clear that my presence in common areas has never involved inappropriate behavior toward other residents. I nod politely, keep interactions brief, and mind my own business. Brooks closed her notebook and exchanged a look with Williams. Captain, we're going to need you to come with us to the base for a formal interview. This is standard procedure, not an arrest. You'll have the opportunity to provide a complete statement, and we'll be contacting your treatment providers for verification of your current status. The ride to the base felt like a regression, like being pulled back into military structure just when I was beginning to navigate civilian independence. The familiar sights of uniformed personnel and official buildings triggered a complex mix of belonging and alienation. This had been my world for 12 years, but I was returning now as someone under investigation rather than someone in command. The interview room was standard military efficiency: fluorescent lighting, metal table, chairs designed for function rather than comfort. Brooks and Williams were joined by a Captain Rodriguez from the base's legal office, a woman whose presence indicated that this matter had already escalated beyond simple complaint resolution. Captain Martinez. Rodriguez began, "We need to establish a clear timeline of events and understand the nature of the allegations being made against you. This interview is being recorded, and you have the right to legal representation if you choose." I declined the lawyer. 12 years of military service had taught me to face problems directly, and I believed that honesty would serve me better than legal maneuvering. I walked them through the timeline: my return from Afghanistan, the diagnosis of PTSD, the move to the apartment complex, the beginning of treatment, the complaints from Gerald Whitman, and the escalating misunderstandings that had brought us to this room. "Let me be clear about something, Captain Rodriguez," I said when they'd finished their questions. Gerald Whitman is a civilian who has decided that my struggles with PTSD represent a threat to his comfort and safety. He's taken symptoms of a documented medical condition and reframed them as evidence of dangerous behavior. I've been nothing but respectful in our limited interactions, but respect apparently doesn't extend to tolerating the existence of a combat veteran dealing with trauma. Rodriguez made notes throughout my statement, her expression neutral but attentive. We'll be conducting a thorough investigation, including interviews with other building residents and verification of your treatment compliance. In the meantime, are you willing to agree to some voluntary conditions while this matter is being resolved? The conditions were predictable: no contact with Gerald Whitman beyond necessary building interactions, continued compliance with VA treatment, and agreement to have my progress monitored by military medical personnel. They weren't unreasonable, but they felt like punishment for the crime of surviving combat and struggling with its aftermath. Walking out of that interview room, I felt the weight of how quickly a veteran's life could be destabilized by civilian fear and misunderstanding. Gerald Whitman had never worn a uniform, never felt the responsibility of keeping other people alive under fire, never experienced the particular kind of trauma that comes from watching friends die in foreign dust. But his comfort in his apartment building apparently outweighed my right to heal from service to my country. The investigation took 3 weeks. Military police interviewed 6 other residents of the building, contacted Dr. Foster and my support group facilitator, and reviewed my service records and medical files. The process felt like having my entire life examined under a microscope, every struggle documented and weighed against civilian expectations of normal behavior. Mrs. Chen, the building manager, told investigators that she'd received no complaints about me other than those from Gerald Whitman. Maria Santos, who lived in 4A, mentioned that she'd heard me moving around at night but understood I was a veteran and had never felt threatened. Tom Bradley from 3C said he'd spoken with me in the laundry room and found me polite and respectful. Dr. Foster provided professional assessment confirming that I was actively engaged in treatment, making progress in managing symptoms, and showed no indicators of violent tendencies or actual danger to others. The support group facilitator corroborated that I was a consistent participant who demonstrated commitment to healing and integration with civilian life. But Gerald Whitman stuck to his story. In his statement, he painted a picture of a dangerous individual who kept irregular hours, appeared in common areas without clear purpose, and had verbally threatened him when confronted about disruptive behavior. He claimed to fear for his safety and that of other building residents, particularly elderly tenants who might be vulnerable to someone with obvious psychological problems. The final report acknowledged that while my behavior might be unusual by civilian standards, it fell well within the normal range of adjustment challenges faced by combat veterans with PTSD. The allegations of threatening behavior were found to be unsubstantiated, based on misinterpretation of statements made in the context of explaining combat-related trauma. No disciplinary action was recommended, but the report suggested continued monitoring to ensure successful transition to civilian life. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I felt exhausted. The investigation had required me to justify my existence as a healing veteran, to prove that my struggles didn't make me dangerous, to demonstrate that someone could survive combat and still deserve the right to live peacefully among civilians who had never faced similar challenges. 2 days after the investigation concluded, I found a note slipped under my door. Gerald Whitman's cramped handwriting informed me that while the military might have dismissed his concerns, he would be monitoring my behavior closely and wouldn't hesitate to contact authorities again if he felt threatened. The note ended with a suggestion that I might be happier living somewhere more appropriate for people with my condition. That night, I called Dr. Foster. Not because I was in crisis, but because I needed someone who understood the particular exhaustion that comes from fighting for the right to heal in plain sight. "Sarah," she said when I'd finished explaining about the note, "what Gerald Whitman did says nothing about your worth or your progress. It says everything about his fear of what he doesn't understand. I know that intellectually, Doc, but it feels like being punished for surviving. That's because, in a way, you are. Society asks veterans to serve, to see and do things that most people never will, and then expects you to return and seamlessly integrate, as if none of that experience matters. When you struggle visibly with that integration, some people see it as a personal failing, rather than a predictable response to trauma." Dr. Foster was right, but rightness didn't make the isolation less real. I was caught between 2 worlds, too changed by military experience to fit seamlessly into civilian life, but too committed to healing to retreat entirely from the society I'd served. The answer, when it came, arrived in the form of another knock on my door 3 weeks later. This time it was Mrs. Chen, but she wasn't carrying a clipboard full of complaints. She was holding an envelope and wearing the kind of smile that suggested good news. "Sarah, I wanted to give you this personally," she said, handing me the envelope. "It's a letter that came for you through the building management office." Inside was a handwritten note from Maria Santos, my neighbor in 4A. She'd written to thank me for something I didn't even remember doing. Apparently, 2 months earlier, when she'd been struggling with groceries and a crying baby in the hallway, I'd helped carry packages to her door and briefly held her daughter while she unlocked her apartment. For her, it had been a moment of kindness from a neighbor. For me, it had been automatic response, the kind of assistance that military culture makes instinctive. "I wanted you to know," Maria had written, "that Mr. Whitman doesn't speak for the rest of us. Most of the building residents think he was wrong to cause trouble for you. We know you're a veteran dealing with difficult stuff, and we respect your service. If you ever need anything, Apartment 4A is always willing to help." The letter was signed not just by Maria but by Tom Bradley, Mrs. Patterson from the first floor, the Johnsons from 2B, and 6 other residents I'd barely spoken to. They'd taken the time to coordinate their support, to make sure I understood that Gerald Whitman's fear and hostility didn't represent the entire building community. That afternoon, I walked to the VA Medical Center for my weekly appointment with Dr. Foster. The building was familiar now, a place where my struggles were understood in context rather than pathologized. In the waiting area, I recognized faces from my support group, other veterans navigating their own transitions between military service and civilian life. "How are you feeling about the investigation being over?" Dr. Foster asked when we'd settled into her office. "Relieved. Mostly. But also angry that it happened at all. Gerald Whitman took my healing process and turned it into evidence that I was dangerous. That feels like a betrayal of everything I sacrificed during deployment. Can you tell me more about that sense of betrayal?" I'd been thinking about this question for weeks, trying to articulate the particular pain of being feared by the very society I'd served to protect. In Afghanistan, I led soldiers into situations where we might not come home, and we did it because we believed we were protecting American civilians' right to live safely. Coming back and having an American civilian treat my trauma as a threat to his safety feels like none of that sacrifice mattered. Dr. Foster nodded. That disconnect between service and civilian reception is something many veterans struggle with. But I want you to consider something, Sarah. Gerald Whitman's reaction doesn't represent all civilians, and it doesn't negate the value of your service. The letter from your neighbors proves that. She was right. The investigation had been initiated by one fearful man, but it had also revealed a community of neighbors who understood and respected my situation. The support of Maria Santos and the other residents felt like a counterbalance to Gerald Whitman's hostility, evidence that civilian appreciation for veteran sacrifice could coexist with understanding of veteran struggles. "What do you think happens next?" I asked. "You continue healing. You continue building relationships with neighbors who see your full humanity rather than just your symptoms. And maybe you consider that your experience with this investigation might help other veterans facing similar challenges." The idea of turning this experience into something useful for other veterans appealed to me. Military service had taught me to find purpose in difficult situations, to extract lessons that might benefit future soldiers. Maybe civilian transition required the same approach. 6 months later, I was standing in the community room of our apartment building, addressing a gathering of residents, building managers from the complex management company, and several representatives from local veteran organizations. Mrs. Chen had organized the meeting after similar conflicts had emerged in other buildings managed by the same company. "My name is Sarah Martinez," I began, looking out at the mix of civilian faces and veteran advocacy representatives. 6 months ago, I became the subject of a military police investigation because a neighbor misunderstood my symptoms of PTSD as threatening behavior. Tonight, I want to talk about how we can build communities where veterans and civilians coexist with mutual understanding and respect. I'd spent weeks preparing this presentation with Dr. Foster and my support group, crafting language that explained veteran experiences without requiring civilian populations to become trauma experts. The goal was creating bridges of understanding that served both communities. PTSD isn't a character flaw or a choice, I continued. It's a documented medical condition that affects how trauma survivors process stress and navigate daily life. For combat veterans, symptoms often include hypervigilance, sleep disturbances, and heightened startle responses. These symptoms can manifest in ways that civilian neighbors might find unusual, but unusual doesn't mean dangerous. Gerald Whitman wasn't in the room. He'd moved out of the building 2 months earlier, citing an uncomfortable living environment. His departure had been quiet, without fanfare or farewell, leaving behind only the memory of how quickly fear could escalate into official action. Maria Santos was there, along with Tom Bradley and several other neighbors who'd signed the letter of support. They listened attentively as I explained the difference between hypervigilance and surveillance, between trauma responses and threatening behavior, between someone struggling with civilian transition and someone who posed actual danger to community safety. The most important thing civilian neighbors can do, I said, is communicate directly and compassionately when concerns arise. Most veterans want to be good neighbors, but we're navigating challenges that aren't always visible or easily understood. A conversation that starts with curiosity rather than suspicion usually leads to solutions that work for everyone. The meeting lasted 2 hours, with questions ranging from practical concerns about noise levels to broader discussions about veteran integration and community responsibility. By the end, the management company had agreed to implement new policies for addressing veteran-related concerns, including mandatory training for building managers and direct liaison with local veteran advocacy organizations. Walking back to my apartment that night, I felt something I hadn't experienced since returning from deployment: a sense of belonging in civilian space. Not because I'd hidden my struggles or pretended PTSD wasn't part of my daily reality, but because I'd found a way to build understanding around those struggles. The next morning brought another knock on my door, but this time I opened it without apprehension. It was Mrs. Chen, carrying a small package and wearing the kind of smile that suggested pleasant surprises. "This came for you yesterday," she said, handing me the package. "But I also wanted to tell you something. The presentation last night has inspired the management company to create a veteran liaison program for all their properties. They want to offer you a position as the program coordinator." The package was from Dr. Foster, containing a book about post-traumatic growth and a note congratulating me on turning a difficult experience into community education. The job offer from the management company represented something even more significant: the opportunity to transform my struggle with one fearful neighbor into systemic change that might benefit veterans across multiple housing communities. That afternoon, I called my support group facilitator to share the news. The 8 veterans who gathered twice weekly had become a chosen family, people who understood the particular challenges of translating military experience into civilian success. They'd supported me through the investigation, celebrating the vindication, and mourning the necessity of having to prove my right to exist peacefully among civilians. Sarah, Tom Rodriguez, a Marine who'd done 3 tours in Iraq, said when I'd finished explaining about the job offer, "You've turned Gerald Whitman's fear into something that's going to help veterans he'll never meet. That's some serious psychological warfare against ignorance." The group laughed, recognizing Tom's ability to find military metaphors for civilian victories. But his words carried truth. I had weaponized understanding against fear, used education to combat the prejudice that too often greeted veterans struggling with invisible wounds. 3 months into the coordinator position, I was working with building managers across the Denver metro area, creating protocols for addressing veteran-related concerns with compassion rather than suspicion. The work involved training sessions for property management staff, resource guides for veteran tenants, and liaison relationships with VA counselors and local veteran organizations. The most rewarding part was the direct intervention calls. When conflicts arose between veteran tenants and civilian neighbors, I could step in with professional understanding and practical solutions. Sometimes the issues were legitimate noise concerns that could be addressed with simple accommodation. Sometimes they were misunderstandings about behavior that looked suspicious to civilian eyes, but made perfect sense in the context of military training and trauma response. Each successful resolution felt like a small victory against the kind of fear and hostility that Gerald Whitman had represented. Every veteran who remained in stable housing, every civilian neighbor who gained understanding about military experience, every building manager who learned to distinguish between concerning behavior and trauma symptoms contributed to a community where service members could heal without hiding. The work also brought unexpected personal rewards. 6 months into the coordinator position, I received a call from Sergeant Brooks, the MP who'd conducted the original investigation. She was transitioning out of military service and struggling with her own apartment search, concerned about how civilian landlords might perceive her military background and the stress-related symptoms she was beginning to experience. "Captain Martinez," she said, I remembered how you handled that investigation with such dignity, even when you were being treated unfairly. I wondered if you might have advice about finding veteran-friendly housing options. The conversation lasted an hour, covering everything from identifying supportive landlords to connecting with civilian neighbors in ways that built understanding rather than suspicion. By the end, I'd referred her to 3 apartment complexes that participated in our Veteran Liaison program and connected her with Dr. Foster's practice for counseling support. I need to tell you something, Brooks said before ending the call. That investigation 8 months ago stayed with me. Watching how a civilian's fear could so quickly escalate into official action against a veteran who was clearly working hard to rebuild her life, it made me realize how vulnerable we all are when we transition back to civilian society. Her words highlighted the broader implications of my experience with Gerald Whitman. The investigation hadn't just been about one veteran and one fearful neighbor. It had been a microcosm of how American society often responds to veterans' struggles, with suspicion and institutional action rather than understanding and community support. A year after the investigation concluded, I was invited to speak at a national conference on veteran housing and community integration. The audience included VA officials, property management professionals, veteran advocacy organizations, and researchers studying post-military transition challenges. 18 months ago, I told the packed auditorium I was living quietly in a Denver apartment complex, working with a VA counselor to manage PTSD symptoms and rebuild my civilian life. A neighbor's complaint about noise from my nightmares escalated into a military police investigation that could have derailed my housing stability and professional future. I paused to let the weight of that statement settle over the audience. That experience taught me that veteran transition isn't just about individual healing. It's about building communities where civilian populations understand military experience well enough to respond to veteran struggles with compassion rather than fear. The presentation covered the systemic changes that had emerged from my individual crisis, the Veteran Liaison Program, the training protocols for property managers, the community education initiatives that were now being replicated in cities across the country. But it also emphasized the personal cost of society's failure to adequately prepare civilian communities for veteran reintegration. Every veteran dealing with PTSD, traumatic brain injury, or other service-connected conditions deserves the right to heal in community rather than in isolation, I concluded. That means civilian neighbors who ask questions instead of making assumptions, building managers who understand accommodation instead of defaulting to complaints, and systems that support veterans through transition rather than punishing them for struggling with it. The standing ovation felt different from military recognition. This applause came from people who understood that veteran service didn't end with discharge, that the real mission began with successful reintegration into the society we'd served to protect. After the conference, I flew back to Denver and drove straight to my apartment building. The place looked the same from the outside, but everything about my relationship to it had changed. I was no longer just a tenant trying to heal quietly without disturbing civilian neighbors. I was a veteran advocate who'd transformed personal struggle into systemic change, who'd turned one man's fear into widespread education about military experience and trauma recovery. Mrs. Chen met me in the lobby, eager to hear about the conference and proud of how her building had become a model for veteran-friendly housing policies. Maria Santos waved from her doorway, where she was corralling her toddler daughter, who now ran to me with the unself-conscious affection of a child who'd grown up seeing a veteran as simply another caring neighbor. That evening, I sat in my apartment looking through files of success stories from the Liaison Program. Veterans who'd avoided eviction because building managers understood their symptoms. Civilian neighbors who'd become advocates after learning about military experience. Property management companies that had transformed their approach to veteran tenants, seeing accommodation as community strength rather than institutional burden. The work had grown beyond anything I'd imagined when I first walked into that MP interview room. What started as personal vindication had become a movement, a systematic effort to build bridges between military and civilian communities that served both populations. 2 years after Gerald Whitman's first complaint, I received an unexpected letter. The return address was unfamiliar, but the handwriting looked vaguely recognizable. Inside was a brief note from Gerald himself, mailed from an address in Florida where he'd apparently relocated to be closer to family. The letter was awkward, clearly difficult for him to write. He acknowledged that his complaints had been based on fear and misunderstanding, that he'd never taken the time to learn about PTSD or consider how his actions might affect a veteran trying to rebuild her life. He'd seen news coverage of the liaison program and realized that his hostility had inadvertently sparked something positive for veteran communities. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he wrote, "because I know my actions caused you real harm. But I wanted you to know that I've learned something from watching what you built after I tried to tear you down. Maybe that matters somehow." The letter sat on my dining table for a week while I decided how to respond. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to let Gerald Whitman live with the consequences of his choices without offering the absolution that might ease his conscience. But another part recognized that his willingness to acknowledge his mistakes represented the same kind of growth I was trying to foster in civilian communities. I finally wrote back, not to forgive or forget, but to acknowledge his honesty and suggest that his experience might be valuable for educating other civilians about the impact of their assumptions and fears on veteran neighbors. If Gerald Whitman wanted to make amends, the best way might be helping other civilian populations understand how fear-based responses to veteran struggles served no one. 3 years after that first knock from the military police, I was standing in the same community room where I'd given my first presentation to building residents. This time the audience was different. A group of newly transitioned veterans participating in a housing readiness workshop that had become a standard part of the liaison program. Community integration isn't just about finding an apartment. I told them, it's about building relationships with civilian neighbors who may not understand military experience but are willing to learn. It's about advocating for yourself when misunderstandings arise, and finding allies who will support your right to heal in community. In the audience was James Chen, Mrs. Chen's son, who'd recently completed his Army service and was beginning his own transition to civilian life. Beside him sat 3 Marines, 2 Navy veterans, and an Air Force tech sergeant, all navigating the complex process of translating military skills and identity into civilian success. "The most important thing to remember," I continued, "is that your struggles with transition don't make you dangerous or unworthy of civilian community membership. They make you human. And human beings deserve to heal in environments that support their recovery rather than punish their symptoms." After the workshop, I walked through the building hallways where my journey had begun. The same fluorescent lighting, the same thin walls, the same mixture of cooking smells and television sounds that characterized apartment living. But now these hallways held different meaning. They were the birthplace of a movement, the place where one veteran's struggle, with one fearful neighbor, had grown into systematic change for veteran communities across the country. My apartment looked the same too. Sparse by design, carefully organized for someone who still needed to manage hypervigilance and occasional sleep disturbances. The blackout curtains remained, along with the strategic furniture placement and the habit of keeping escape routes clear. But the space no longer felt like a fortress where I hid from civilian judgment. It felt like home base for work that mattered, a place where healing and advocacy could coexist. That night, I called Dr. Foster for our monthly check-in. Our therapeutic relationship had evolved as my symptoms stabilized and my civilian integration progressed, but the connection remained important for maintaining the psychological tools that made my advocacy work possible. "How are you feeling about where you are now compared to where you were 3 years ago?" she asked. "Grateful, mostly, and still angry sometimes, but it's productive anger now. Anger that motivates change, rather than anger that just burns." Can you say more about that distinction? When Gerald Whitman was making complaints and I was under investigation, my anger was about being misunderstood and mistreated. It was personal and isolating. Now my anger is about systems that fail veterans and civilian communities that haven't been educated to support military transition. It's anger I can do something with. Dr. Foster made notes, a habit that had become as familiar as military routine. That transformation from personal pain to systemic action is exactly the kind of post-traumatic growth we hope to see in trauma survivors. You've taken your worst experience and used it to prevent similar experiences for other people. The growth felt real but incomplete. Every success story from the liaison program reminded me how many veterans were still struggling with housing discrimination, civilian misunderstanding, and the particular isolation that comes from serving a society that doesn't always know how to welcome you home. The work continued to expand. 5 years after Gerald Whitman's first complaint, the Veteran Liaison Program was operating in 6 states, with funding from both VA grants and private property management companies who discovered that veteran-friendly policies improved their overall tenant satisfaction and community stability. I'd been promoted to regional director, overseeing a team of coordinators who were themselves veterans, with their own stories of civilian transition challenges and advocacy success. Each coordinator brought different perspectives: combat veterans and support personnel, enlisted soldiers and officers, people who'd served in different eras and different conflicts, but all united by the experience of navigating the gap between military service and civilian belonging. The program had also evolved beyond housing issues to include employment advocacy, healthcare navigation, and family support services. What had started as a response to one neighbor's complaints about PTSD symptoms had grown into comprehensive veteran transition support that addressed the full spectrum of challenges facing military personnel returning to civilian life. The most meaningful measure of success wasn't the statistics or awards, though those were gratifying. It was the individual stories, veterans who'd maintained a stable housing because building managers understood their needs, civilian neighbors who'd become allies and friends after learning about military experience, families who'd been spared the trauma of housing, discrimination, and community rejection. Each success felt like a small victory against the fear and ignorance that Gerald Whitman had represented, proof that civilian communities could learn. 6 months after the military police investigation concluded, I thought the worst of my civilian transition was behind me. The apartment had become a sanctuary where I could practice the healing techniques Dr. Foster taught me, where I could wake from nightmares without worrying about explaining myself to anyone. The support from Maria Santos and the other neighbors had created a buffer of understanding that made daily life manageable. But Gerald Whitman wasn't finished with me. The first sign came on a Tuesday morning when I walked to my car for a grocery run. Someone had scratched deep lines into the paint on the driver's side door, spelling out words I won't repeat here. The scratches were fresh, silver metal showing through the navy paint like wounds. My hands didn't shake as I examined the damage, but my heart rate spiked in the familiar way that meant my nervous system was preparing for combat that wouldn't come. I took photographs and called the police, following the protocols that military service had taught me about documentation and proper channels. Officer Jennifer Walsh arrived within 20 minutes, a middle-aged woman with the kind of steady professionalism that suggested she'd handled plenty of property damage cases before. "Any idea who might have done this, Ms. Martinez?" she asked, walking around the car with her camera. "I have suspicions, but no proof," I replied. "There was a neighbor who made complaints about me to military authorities several months ago. The investigation found no merit to his allegations, but he wasn't happy with that outcome." Officer Walsh made notes while photographing the scratches from multiple angles. "Has there been any contact between you and this neighbor since the military investigation?" "None directly. He moved out of the building about 4 months ago, but I received one letter from him, which I still have if you need to see it." The letter had been Gerald's awkward attempt at acknowledgement, but rereading it now in the context of vandalized property, I wondered if I'd misinterpreted his motives. Maybe his words about learning from the experience had been less about genuine growth and more about positioning himself for future action. "I'd like to see that letter," Walsh said, "and I'll need to file a report that includes the background you've mentioned." Property destruction often escalates if the perpetrator doesn't face consequences. The word escalation sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the October morning air. In Afghanistan, escalation meant mortar rounds and roadside bombs, threats that came with protocols and protective equipment, and the support of fellow soldiers. Here, escalation meant something more insidious: the slow destruction of the peaceful civilian life I was trying to build. That afternoon, I called Dr. Foster to schedule an emergency session. The vandalism had triggered something deeper than anger or frustration. It had awakened the hypervigilance that I'd been working so hard to manage. the constant scanning for threats that made normal life feel impossible. "How are you feeling about your safety right now?" Dr. Foster asked when I'd settled into the familiar chair in her office. "Physically, I'm probably fine. Gerald doesn't strike me as someone who would escalate to actual violence. But psychologically, this feels like being under siege again. Like I can't let my guard down because the next attack could come from anywhere." "That's a completely understandable response, Sarah. You've been working hard to create a safe space for healing, and someone has deliberately violated that safety. Your nervous system is responding to a real threat, even if that threat is different from the ones you faced in combat." We spent the session developing strategies for managing the renewed hypervigilance without completely retreating from civilian engagement. Increased security, measures that would provide practical protection without becoming a prison. Communication protocols for staying connected with supportive neighbors and authorities. And most importantly, reminders that one person's vindictiveness didn't negate the progress I'd made or the community I'd built. The second incident happened a week later. I was returning from my evening jog, the routine that helped burn off excess adrenaline and prepare my body for sleep, when I noticed something wrong with my apartment door. The lock looked normal, but there were fresh scratches around the deadbolt, the kind of marks that suggested someone had been experimenting with entry tools. This time, I didn't hesitate. I called 911 from the hallway, explaining that someone had attempted to break into my apartment and that I had reason to believe it was connected to previous harassment. I also called Mrs. Chen to report the incident to building management and texted Maria Santos to let her know what was happening. Officer Walsh arrived first, followed by a detective named Marcus Johnson, who specialized in stalking and harassment cases. Johnson was a tall man with graying hair and the kind of patient demeanor that suggested he'd dealt with plenty of situations where fear and evidence didn't always align neatly. "Ms. Martinez, I've read the report about the car vandalism," he said while examining my door lock. "Combined with this attempted break-in and the background you've provided about the previous neighbor complaint, I think we're looking at a pattern of escalating harassment. What does that mean in terms of next steps?" I asked. "It means we take this seriously and start building a case. I'm going to recommend that we increase patrol frequency in this area, and I want you to consider additional security measures for your apartment. We're also going to revisit that letter you mentioned and see if we can establish any connections between your former neighbor's location and these incidents." Detective Johnson spent 2 hours examining the scene, interviewing Mrs. Chen and several neighbors, and reviewing building security footage that might show unusual activity around my door. The investigation felt thorough, but also highlighted how vulnerable apartment living could be for someone whose nervous system was already primed for threat detection. Maria Santos knocked on my door that evening, carrying a covered dish and wearing the kind of concerned expression that meant she'd been thinking about my situation all day. "I brought you dinner," she said. "But I also wanted to talk about something. My husband Carlos works in building security downtown, and he knows some people who do residential security assessments. Would you be interested in having them look at your apartment and suggest improvements?" The offer was exactly the kind of practical support that made the difference between isolation and community integration. Maria wasn't trying to solve my problems or minimize my concerns. She was offering resources that might help me regain some sense of control over my environment. "I'd appreciate that very much," I said. "I've been thinking about security upgrades, but I don't know enough about residential systems to make good choices." Carlos Santos arrived the next morning with a man named David Kim, a former Marine who'd transitioned into civilian security consulting after his military service. Kim understood immediately why a combat veteran might need enhanced security measures that went beyond standard civilian concerns. "The goal," he explained while examining my door and windows, "is creating layers of protection that give you early warning and multiple options if someone tries to gain unauthorized access. We want security that helps you sleep better, not equipment that makes you feel like you're living in a bunker." The assessment revealed several vulnerabilities that civilian renters might not consider. The door lock was adequate for deterring casual break-ins but wouldn't stop someone with basic tools and determination. The windows were accessible from the fire escape and had no additional security measures, and the apartment's layout made it difficult to monitor potential entry points while maintaining normal living patterns. Kim's recommendations were practical and affordable. A reinforced door frame and high-security deadbolt, window sensors that would alert me to any attempted entry, a small security camera system that covered the hallway and fire escape, and a personal alarm system that would summon both police and building security if activated. The most important thing, he said while writing up his recommendations, is that you feel like you have options if something happens. Hypervigilance gets worse when you feel trapped or defenseless. Good security planning gives your nervous system permission to relax because your environment is actually safer. The security improvements took a week to install and cost more than I'd planned to spend, but the psychological benefit was immediate. For the first time since returning from deployment, I could sleep without positioning myself where I could monitor every possible entry point. The motion sensors and cameras provided the early warning system that my military training insisted was necessary for true security. But Gerald Whitman wasn't finished escalating. The phone calls started 3 weeks after the attempted break-in. Always late at night. Always when I was settling into sleep. Always from numbers that showed up as blocked or unavailable on caller ID. No one spoke when I answered, just silence and the faint sound of breathing before the line went dead. The first few calls, I assumed, were wrong numbers or technical glitches. But after a week of 2 a.m. wake-ups, the pattern became clear. Someone was deliberately disrupting my sleep, targeting the exact vulnerability that PTSD had created. The timing was too precise to be coincidental, too consistent to be random. Detective Johnson took the harassment report seriously, but phone calls without verbal threats were difficult to prosecute. He arranged for call tracing on my line and advised me to keep a detailed log of every incident, including time, duration, and any background sounds that might help identify the caller's location. Harassment cases often require patience and documentation, he explained. The perpetrator usually makes mistakes over time that give us the evidence we need for charges. But I understand that waiting for legal resolution doesn't help with the immediate impact on your daily life. The sleep disruption was devastating in ways that civilian populations rarely understand. PTSD had already compromised my ability to achieve deep restorative sleep. The combination of nightmares, hypervigilance, and conditioned responses to unexpected sounds meant that healthy sleep required careful management and optimal conditions. The late-night phone calls shattered that careful balance. Even when I turned off the ringer, my nervous system remained alert for the intrusion. Even when I changed my number, the first few nights were spent waiting for the harassment to resume. Sleep became a battle against my own expectation of interruption. Dr. Foster helped me develop strategies for protecting my sleep cycle despite the ongoing harassment. Sound machines that would mask the phone noise, meditation techniques that could help me return to sleep after disruptions, and medication adjustments that might improve my sleep quality without creating dependency issues. What frustrates me most, I told her during one session, is that this person knows exactly how to target my specific vulnerabilities. The car vandalism was random property damage. The attempted break-in was scary but general. But these phone calls are surgical strikes against the exact thing I need most for healing. That level of targeted harassment suggests someone who has either observed your patterns closely or has specific knowledge about PTSD symptoms, Dr. Foster replied. Have you considered that your former neighbor might have done research about veterans' struggles since your original conflict? The possibility that Gerald Whitman had studied my condition in order to weaponize harassment against it was both infuriating and terrifying. It suggested a level of premeditation and malice that went far beyond neighborhood complaints or fear-based misunderstanding. 4 weeks into the phone harassment, I received an envelope with no return address, postmarked from Denver but with handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a printed message. Veterans who can't handle civilian life should find somewhere else to live. Some of us won't stop until you get the message. This was the evidence Detective Johnson had been waiting for. Written threats were prosecutable in ways that silent phone calls weren't, and the language directly connected to the previous harassment pattern. The envelope and paper would be examined for fingerprints and DNA evidence, and the postal investigation could help narrow down the sender's location. "This changes everything," Johnson explained when I brought him the letter. "We're no longer dealing with simple harassment. This is criminal intimidation with potential hate crime enhancements because it's targeting you based on your veteran status." The investigation expanded to include federal postal authorities and military liaison officers who specialized in crimes against service members. The resources being deployed felt disproportionate to my individual situation, but Johnson explained that veteran-targeted harassment was an emerging pattern that law enforcement took seriously. "You're not the first veteran we've seen targeted this way," he said. "There's a small but concerning trend of civilians who specifically harass veterans with PTSD, often using research about trauma symptoms to maximize psychological damage. We've been looking for a case with enough evidence to prosecute effectively." The attention felt overwhelming and validating simultaneously. For months, I'd been dealing with escalating harassment that made me question my own perceptions and wonder if I was overreacting to normal civilian rudeness. Having law enforcement confirm that the pattern was both criminal and part of a broader trend legitimized my concerns and provided hope for resolution. But it also meant acknowledging that my individual struggle was connected to something larger and more systematic than one neighbor's fear and ignorance. Someone, somewhere, had decided that veterans with PTSD were legitimate targets for harassment designed to drive us out of civilian communities. The breakthrough came 6 weeks later when forensic analysis of the threatening letter revealed partial fingerprints that matched prints found on my car. The postal investigation had narrowed the mailing location to a specific zip code in suburban Denver, and cross-referencing that area with Gerald Whitman's known associates led to a surprising discovery. The harassment wasn't coming from Gerald himself. It was coming from his nephew, Marcus Whitman, a man in his 30s who lived near the postal facility where the letter had been mailed. Marcus had no military background, no direct knowledge of me, and no obvious motive for targeting a veteran he'd never met. "It appears that your original neighbor complaint became a family obsession," Detective Johnson explained during the briefing about Marcus Whitman's arrest. Gerald told his nephew about the military investigation, portrayed himself as a victim of veteran violence, and Marcus decided to take action to protect his uncle and other civilians from dangerous veterans. The revelation was simultaneously relieving and horrifying. Relieving because it meant Gerald himself wasn't stalking me, that his awkward letter of acknowledgement might have been genuine. Horrifying because it meant my struggle with one fearful neighbor had metastasized into someone else's mission to harass veterans with PTSD. Marcus Whitman had been remarkably thorough in his research about veteran trauma symptoms and civilian integration challenges. His computer contained extensive downloaded materials about PTSD, articles about veteran housing discrimination, and forum discussions about strategies for encouraging unwanted neighbors to relocate. "He approached harassing you like a research project," Johnson continued. "He studied your specific vulnerabilities and designed each escalation to target your symptoms in ways that would be difficult to prosecute, but maximally disruptive to your healing process." The criminal charges included stalking, criminal intimidation, attempted breaking and entering, property destruction, and federal charges related to using postal services for harassment. The evidence was overwhelming: fingerprints, phone records, the threatening letter, and digital records of his research into anti-veteran harassment strategies. But the legal resolution, while satisfying, didn't immediately repair the psychological damage. Months of escalating harassment had rewired my nervous system back toward constant vigilance. The security improvements to my apartment helped, but they couldn't undo the conditioning that made every unexpected sound feel like a potential threat. Dr. Foster helped me understand that recovery from targeted harassment required different strategies than recovery from combat trauma. The harassment had been designed specifically to exploit my PTSD symptoms, which meant healing needed to address both the original military trauma and the civilian trauma that had been layered on top. "One of the most insidious things about what happened to you," she explained, "is that it attacked your ability to feel safe in the civilian environment you were trying to integrate into. Combat trauma affects your nervous system, but harassment trauma affects your faith in civilian society's willingness to let you belong." The distinction was crucial for understanding why Marcus Whitman's arrest didn't immediately restore my sense of security. Legal justice addressed the criminal behavior, But psychological healing required rebuilding trust in civilian communities and faith in my right to exist peacefully among people who'd never worn a uniform. The process took months of careful work. Gradual re-engagement with building community activities, patience with the setbacks that came when unexpected sounds triggered renewed hypervigilance, celebrating small victories like sleeping through the night without checking the security cameras, or walking to my car without scanning for potential threats. Maria Santos and the other supportive neighbors played crucial roles in that healing process. They didn't pretend the harassment hadn't happened or minimize its impact, but they also didn't treat me like a victim who needed constant protection. They treated me like a neighbor who'd been wronged and deserved support in reclaiming her right to live peacefully. "What happened to you was horrible," Maria said one evening when we were talking in the building lobby. "But it doesn't change who you are or what you've accomplished." Marcus Whitman was a coward who attacked someone who served her country. That says everything about him and nothing about you. The Veteran Liaison program I'd been developing took on new urgency after the harassment case. Marcus Whitman's research into veteran vulnerabilities revealed how much information was available to anyone who wanted to target military personnel transitioning to civilian life. The same online resources that helped veterans understand their symptoms could be weaponized by people who wanted to exploit those symptoms. Working with Detective Johnson and federal investigators, I helped develop training materials for law enforcement about recognizing veteran-targeted harassment. The patterns were becoming more common. Civilians who specifically researched PTSD symptoms to maximize psychological damage, harassment strategies designed to trigger veteran trauma responses, and intimidation campaigns aimed at driving veterans out of civilian housing. The irony: I told a conference of police chiefs 6 months after Marcus Whitman's conviction, is that the people targeting veterans with harassment often claim to be protecting civilian communities from dangerous military personnel. In reality, they're the ones creating danger by systematically attacking people who served to protect civilian safety. The law enforcement training program expanded to include VA medical staff, veteran advocacy organizations, and property management companies. Everyone who worked with transitioning veterans needed to understand that harassment targeting military personnel was both a crime and a national security issue that undermined veteran reintegration. But the most important audience was civilian communities themselves. Marcus Whitman hadn't operated in isolation. His anti-veteran harassment had been enabled by online communities that shared strategies for targeting military personnel, forums that treated veterans' struggles as threats to civilian comfort rather than predictable responses to trauma. Educational outreach became a crucial component of the liaison program. Community presentations that helped civilian populations understand the difference between veteran trauma symptoms and actual threats. Resource guides that explained how neighbors could support veteran integration rather than fear it. And clear protocols for addressing concerns about veteran behavior through communication rather than complaints. The goal, I explained to civilian audiences, isn't asking you to become trauma therapist or ignore legitimate safety concerns. It's asking you to recognize that veterans are civilians too, people who've served your communities and deserve the chance to rejoin them successfully. The presentations often revealed how much misinformation civilian populations had absorbed about veteran mental health. Myths about widespread veteran violence, assumptions that PTSD symptoms indicated instability, and fears that military training made veterans inherently dangerous to civilian communities. Addressing those misconceptions required patience and careful education. Statistics about veteran crime rates that were actually lower than civilian populations. Information about PTSD symptoms that explained hypervigilance and sleep disturbances without pathologizing normal trauma responses. And personal stories that humanized veteran experiences without exploiting trauma for sympathy. The work was exhausting and essential. Every civilian neighbor who learned to communicate rather than complain, every building manager who chose accommodation over eviction, every community that welcomed veterans rather than feared them represented progress toward the society I'd served to protect. Marcus Whitman's trial provided a platform for highlighting these broader issues. His conviction on federal charges sent a message that veteran harassment would be prosecuted aggressively, but the media coverage also educated civilian populations about the harassment tactics being used against military personnel. This case represents more than one individual's criminal behavior, the federal prosecutor said during her closing arguments. It represents a pattern of targeting American veterans with harassment designed to drive them out of civilian communities. When we attack the men and women who serve to protect our freedoms, we attack the values that define our democracy. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before convicting Marcus Whitman on all charges. His sentence included prison time, financial restitution for my security improvements and counseling costs, and a restraining order that prohibited any contact with me or interference with my housing. But more importantly, the case established legal precedent for prosecuting veteran-targeted harassment and created awareness about the scope of the problem. Law enforcement agencies across the country began identifying similar cases, and federal resources were allocated for investigating harassment campaigns against military personnel. The personal vindication felt complete, but the systemic change felt like the beginning of a larger mission. My experience with Gerald Whitman's initial complaints and Marcus Whitman's escalating harassment had revealed gaps in civilian understanding and protection systems that affected thousands of veterans trying to rebuild their lives. 2 years after Marcus Whitman's conviction, I was standing before a congressional subcommittee on veteran affairs, testifying about the need for federal legislation protecting veterans from housing discrimination and harassment. The room was filled with lawmakers, veteran advocacy representatives, and military personnel who understood that successful reintegration required more than individual resilience. Committee members, I began, veteran homelessness isn't just about affordable housing availability. It's about civilian communities that either welcome veterans home or drive them away through fear, misunderstanding, and targeted harassment. The testimony covered legislative recommendations that had emerged from the liaison program, federal protections against veteran-targeted harassment, funding for civilian education about military trauma, and resources for law enforcement training about veteran-specific crimes. The case that brought me here today started with one neighbor's complaint about PTSD symptoms and escalated to federal criminal charges for harassment designed to drive a veteran out of civilian housing. I continued. That escalation was preventable through education, communication, and community support systems that we have the knowledge and resources to implement. The questions from committee members revealed both understanding and frustration about the challenges facing veteran reintegration. Several lawmakers shared stories from their own districts about veterans struggling with civilian acceptance, while others asked pointed questions about the federal government's responsibility for supporting military personnel beyond their active service. Captain Martinez, Representative Williams from Texas, asked, "What would successful veteran reintegration look like in terms of concrete policy changes?" Successful reintegration means civilian communities that understand military experience well enough to respond to veteran struggles with support rather than suspicion, I replied. It means legal protections against discrimination based on veteran status or service-connected disabilities. And it means recognition that veteran reintegration is a national security issue that affects military recruitment, retention, and the well-being of families who serve. The hearing lasted 4 hours and generated bipartisan support for legislation that would expand federal protections for veterans transitioning to civilian life. The bill wouldn't solve every challenge facing military personnel leaving active duty, but it would create legal remedies for the harassment and discrimination that too often derailed successful reintegration. 6 months later, the Veterans Housing Protection Act was signed into law, establishing federal penalties for harassment targeting veterans based on their military service or service-connected disabilities. The legislation also provided funding for civilian education programs and law enforcement training about veteran-specific issues. Standing in the Rose Garden, watching the bill signing ceremony, I thought about the journey that had brought me from a fearful apartment tenant hiding PTSD symptoms to a veteran advocate helping shape federal policy. Gerald Whitman's initial complaints had seemed like personal attacks on my right to heal in civilian community. Marcus Whitman's harassment campaign had felt like systematic assault on my ability to belong in American society. But both experiences had revealed something larger. The gap between military service and civilian understanding that affected every veteran trying to translate their military identity into civilian success. My individual struggle had become a lens for examining how American society receives its returning veterans. And the work that emerged from that examination was changing communities across the country. The liaison program was now operating in 12 states, with federal funding and partnerships with major property management companies. The law enforcement training had been adopted by police departments nationwide, and the civilian education initiatives were being implemented in communities with significant veteran populations. Each success story felt like a victory against the fear and ignorance that Gerald and Marcus Whitman had represented. Every veteran who maintained stable housing, every civilian neighbor who became an ally, every community that chose welcome over wariness contributed to the society I'd envisioned when I first put on a uniform. But the work was far from finished. New veterans were returning from deployments every day, facing the same challenges of translating military experience into civilian belonging. New civilian communities were grappling with how to support military personnel they didn't understand, and new gaps in policy and practice were being revealed as veteran populations and civilian expectations continued to evolve. The apartment in Denver had become more than my home. It was the headquarters for work that mattered, the place where healing and advocacy intersected to create something larger than individual recovery. The security improvements remained, not because I still felt threatened, but because they represented the practical reality that safety was something veterans had to actively create rather than passively expect. Dr. Foster and I had transitioned from weekly trauma therapy to monthly consultation about the psychological aspects of advocacy work. The conversations now focused less on managing PTSD symptoms and more on sustaining the emotional energy required for systemic change efforts. "How do you prevent this work from becoming a form of re-traumatization?" she asked during one session. "You're constantly engaging with stories of veteran harassment and civilian rejection. How do you protect your own healing while fighting for other people's rights?" "I think about Maria Santos and the neighbors who signed that letter," I replied. "For every Gerald Whitman or Marcus Whitman, there are dozens of civilian neighbors who want to do the right thing but don't know how. The work doesn't re-traumatize me because it's changing the conditions that create trauma for other veterans." The distinction felt important for understanding how advocacy could become part of healing rather than an obstacle to it. When trauma survivors worked to prevent others from experiencing similar harm, the effort could transform personal pain into meaningful purpose. But only if the work was sustainable and connected to genuine systemic change, rather than just individual assistance. 5 years after Gerald Whitman's first complaint, I received an invitation that highlighted how much had changed. The Denver VA Medical Center was hosting its first annual Community Integration Celebration, an event designed to honor civilian neighbors who had gone above and beyond in supporting veteran reintegration. Maria Santos was being recognized for her role in supporting my transition and helping establish the building's veteran-friendly policies. Mrs. Chen was receiving an award for her leadership in implementing the liaison program across the management company's properties. Tom Bradley and several other neighbors were being honored for their commitment to creating inclusive community spaces. Standing at the podium to introduce the award recipients, I looked out at an audience that included veterans, civilian neighbors, property managers, law enforcement officers, and VA staff. The room represented the kind of collaboration that made successful reintegration possible, the bridge between military and civilian communities that too often remained unbuilt. 5 years ago, I was a combat veteran struggling with PTSD symptoms and trying to rebuild my life in civilian housing. A neighbor's fear of my trauma responses escalated into harassment that could have destroyed my housing stability and derailed my healing process. The audience listened with the kind of attention that meant the story resonated with their own experiences, either as veterans who'd faced similar challenges, or as civilians who'd witnessed the struggles of military personnel in their communities. But that same building that housed my harasser also housed neighbors who chose understanding over fear, support over suspicion, and community over isolation. I continued. The difference between successful veteran reintegration and continued struggle often comes down to whether civilian communities choose to welcome veterans home or drive them away. The awards ceremony celebrated specific individuals, but it also recognized the broader transformation that civilian education and veteran advocacy could create. The apartment building where my journey had begun was now a model for veteran-friendly housing policies, and the practices developed there were being replicated in communities across the region. After the ceremony, I drove back to my apartment through neighborhoods where other veterans were living their own versions of civilian reintegration. Some were thriving with the support of understanding neighbors and adequate resources. Others were struggling with isolation, discrimination, and the particular challenges that came with translating military identity into civilian belonging. The work continued because the need continued. Every day brought new veterans returning from deployments, new civilian communities grappling with how to support military personnel, and new opportunities to build bridges between populations that had served together in different ways. Sitting in my apartment that evening, I reflected on the journey from Gerald Whitman's first complaint to federal legislation protecting veteran rights. The path had been neither straight nor predictable, marked by setbacks and breakthroughs that revealed both the worst and best of civilian responses to veteran struggles. But the destination felt meaningful in ways that individual healing alone could never achieve. My struggle with neighborhood harassment had become a catalyst for systemic change that was improving conditions for veterans across the country. The fear and hostility that Gerald and Marcus Whitman had represented were being countered by education, legislation, and community-building efforts that created space for veterans to heal in civilian communities. The apartment remained sparse by design, organized for someone who still needed to manage occasional PTSD symptoms and maintain the security protocols that made civilian life manageable. But it no longer felt like a fortress where I hid from civilian judgment. It felt like the foundation for work that mattered, a place where personal healing and social change could coexist and reinforce each other. The phone rang as I was preparing for sleep, and for a moment, my nervous system tensed with the memory of Marcus Whitman's harassment calls. But the caller ID showed Maria Santos' number, and her voice carried the warmth of someone calling with good news rather than problems. "Sarah, I wanted you to be the first to know," she said. "Carlos got promoted to head of security for the downtown complex, and they want him to implement the veteran liaison protocols company-wide. Your program is going to help hundreds more veterans find stable housing." The news felt like validation and motivation simultaneously. Each expansion of the program represented veterans who wouldn't have to navigate the isolation and discrimination that had marked my own transition. Each success story proved that civilian communities could learn to welcome veterans home rather than drive them away. But it also meant more work, more training sessions, more community presentations, and more opportunities to transform individual struggles into systemic solutions. The mission that had emerged from my apartment harassment was expanding faster than any individual advocate could manage alone. The challenge for the next phase would be building sustainable systems that could continue the work without requiring constant crisis intervention. Veterans shouldn't have to become advocates to secure their right to civilian community membership. Civilian populations shouldn't need extensive education to treat veterans with basic respect and understanding. The goal was creating communities where military service was understood and valued, where veterans' struggles were met with support rather than suspicion, and where successful reintegration was the expected outcome rather than the exception. It was an ambitious vision that required changing hearts and minds across civilian populations that often had little direct contact with military personnel. But the foundation had been built through the work that emerged from my individual crisis. The policies, programs, and partnerships were in place to support the larger transformation. And the success stories were accumulating evidence that change was possible when veterans and civilians worked together to build the communities they both deserved. The apartment in Denver remained my home base, but the work it had inspired was creating homes for veterans across the country. Every night I fell asleep in the security of my own space. I knew that other veterans were finding similar security, because civilian communities were learning to make room for military personnel transitioning back to the society they'd served to protect. The journey from Gerald Whitman's first complaint to federal veteran protection legislation had taken 5 years, but the destination felt like the beginning of something larger, rather than the completion of individual advocacy. The work continued because the mission continued, ensuring that every veteran who served to protect American communities would find those communities ready to welcome them home. The knock this time was different. Gentle, respectful, announced. When I opened the door, I found Gerald Whitman standing in my hallway, older and smaller than I remembered, holding a manila envelope with hands that shook slightly. "Ms. Martinez," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I know I have no right to be here, but I need to give you something. 2 years had passed since his nephew Marcus was sentenced to federal prison for the harassment campaign. Now Gerald stood before me, civilian clothes rumpled, eyes carrying the weight of someone who had finally understood the consequences of his actions. Inside the envelope were newspaper clippings about the Veterans Housing Protection Act, printouts of articles about my advocacy work, and a handwritten letter. Gerald had been following the legislation that emerged from our conflict, tracking how my individual struggle had transformed into federal policy protecting veterans nationwide. I went to the VA hospital, he said. I volunteered to speak to groups about civilian responsibility to veterans. I tell them what happens when fear and ignorance drive our responses to people who served our country. The revelation was stunning. Gerald Whitman, whose complaints had nearly derailed my civilian transition, had become an advocate for veteran integration. The man who had once viewed my PTSD symptoms as threats was now educating other civilians about supporting military personnel returning home. His letter detailed volunteer work at the Denver VA, where he spoke to civilian family members about supporting veteran relatives, and his presentations to neighborhood associations about creating veteran-friendly communities. Gerald had transformed his guilt into action, using his experience as someone who had gotten it wrong to help other civilians get it right. I can't undo what I did to you, the letter read, but I can make sure that other veterans don't face the same ignorance and hostility that I showed you. Every civilian neighbor I educate, every family member I help understand, every community that chooses support over suspicion is my way of honoring the service that I failed to recognize. 6 months later, I was invited to speak at the same VA support group where Gerald volunteered. The coordinator wanted both perspectives: my voice as a veteran who had experienced civilian hostility and transformed it into advocacy, and Gerald's voice as a civilian who had learned from his mistakes. When I filed complaints against Captain Martinez, Gerald told the audience, I thought I was protecting my building community. Instead, I was attacking someone whose service had protected my freedom to live safely in that building. The irony was complete, and the harm was real. This session revealed the complexity of civilian-veteran relationships and the misunderstandings that complicated them. Family members asked about supporting veteran relatives without enabling concerning behaviors. Neighbors inquired about the difference between legitimate safety concerns and discrimination based on veteran status. After the session, Gerald approached me in the parking lot, his demeanor respectful and cautious. I hope someday you'll believe that my advocacy work is genuine, rather than just an attempt to ease my guilt, he said. Mr. Whitman, your motivations are between you and your conscience. What matters to me is that veterans benefit from your education efforts, regardless of why you're doing them. The exchange felt like closure without reconciliation, acknowledgement without absolution. Gerald's transformation was real and valuable for veteran communities, but it didn't erase the trauma his original actions had caused. 2 years later, the Veterans Housing Protection Act was being expanded to include additional protections against discrimination in employment, healthcare, and public accommodations. Gerald's advocacy work had contributed to building civilian support for the expanded legislation. Standing in the Capitol building watching the signing ceremony, I reflected on the unlikely journey from apartment harassment to federal policy influence. Gerald Whitman's fear had nearly destroyed my civilian transition, but it had also revealed gaps in veteran protection that affected thousands of military personnel. His transformation from fearful complainer to veteran advocate represented the possibility for growth that made civilian education worthwhile. Not because all hostile civilians would become allies, but because enough could learn to do better to create communities where veterans could heal and thrive. The evening of the expanded legislation signing, I received a final letter from Gerald. He was moving to Florida but wanted me to know that his advocacy work would continue in his new community. I will spend the rest of my life trying to undo the harm that my ignorance and fear caused to you and other veterans, he wrote. Not because I expect forgiveness, but because the work itself has become my way of honoring the service that I failed to recognize when it mattered most. That night, I fell asleep in the apartment where this journey had begun, secure in the knowledge that my individual struggle had become a catalyst for changes that would protect thousands of veterans I would never meet. The work had transformed personal pain into meaningful purpose, individual trauma into systemic solutions, and one man's fear into federal legislation protecting veteran rights. Every veteran who found stable housing, every civilian neighbor who chose understanding over fear, every community that welcomed military personnel home rather than driving them away, represented victory against the ignorance and hostility that Gerald Whitman had once embodied, but ultimately helped to overcome. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.